I appreciate you here. I thank the forum for this great honor, and I thank all the organizing committee and all the institutions that were responsible to give me this award and have me here. I wrote a book a couple years ago called The Evolution of Human Cooperation. The intent of the book is to move away from our traditional understanding of cultural evolution to more of an agent-based model of the evolution of cooperation using game theory, evolutionary game theory, and economic anthropology. The first encounters, so the summary of the, do we have a counter? How much time is it? No, we don't. All right. I thought we had a counter. So the idea is that if you look at the 19th century, the first encounters of Europeans who eventually would go on to create traditional cultural evolutionary theory was to create the notion of the primitive economy. Basically, this is false. The elaborate rituals that they encountered, in fact, were quite rational from an evolutionary game theory point of view. Complexity in non-state complex societies develops in the absence of coercion, unlike in state societies where you do have coercion. And these societies are structured very differently than states. These economies are ritualized. This is the key to keeping a society that does not have coercion cooperating. One deals with the so-called collective action problem. And so you have rituals and feasts control the nature and the timing of work. Competitive feasting and other forms of ritual behavior become the means by which people cooperate in these societies. And so I just mentioned this, go briefly. As I said, they were wrong. These so-called primitive societies, with a slightly deeper analysis of the historical and ethnographic data, indicate that these are actually from an evolutionary game theory point of view, and getting people to cooperate is quite brilliant because they're able to maintain high levels of cooperation in the absence of coercive mechanisms. And here is just, in my book, I have a whole chapter on the absence of coercion in non-state societies. And again, I emphasize that once you get state-level societies, you have quite a bit of coercion. But the question to answer the early evolution of these complex societies. So the ritualized economy is where you use a ritual to time your labor, time your agricultural labor, time your non-agricultural labor, and keep these kinds of cooperation going. And monumental constructions are one of the key indices, one of the key material indicators of a highly complex society prior to coercive mechanisms. So from the middle Holocene onward, the default political organization and throughout the world, in fact, in these was complex non-state societies that organized their economy around ritualized events, calendars, and ideologies. And I work in Peru. I've been working in Peru for 30 years. And so let's take a quick look at the kind of research that we've been doing that illustrates the utility of this approach. Here we have a map. We're going to talk briefly about the North Coast. Then we're going to go to the Titicaca Basin, where that lake is, and then we'll shift to the South Coast. The very first monumental constructions in Peru in the 4th millennium BCE were simple platform mounds with some structures on top. Most importantly, they had, go back, sorry. Most importantly, got it. So these would be the all of the structures had sunken courts associated with an elevated platform, a pyramid and a sunken court. They were always round in the north coast of Peru, and so this whole configuration of this site literally shouts some kind of performance, some kind of procession. Extremely importantly, you have many of these. In the earliest periods, we have lots and lots of these monumental constructions. They're not rare. It's not a model in which you have one that continues to grow larger and larger and larger and dominates an area. It's just the opposite. You have many, many of these sites throughout the landscape that creates a competitive environment where elites are seeking to increase their factions. Let's go to the Titicaca Basin here quickly. This is a sunken court in the Titicaca Basin, and you can see it's used as a corral now, but it's surrounded, as you can see, by houses, and they will always have these stela or monoliths inside the court. This is at the height of the sunken court system in non-state societies. This is known as pucara, and you can see these elaborate slabs and these large sunken courts. This is a state-level society. It is the only sunken court in the entire Titicaca Basin at the time. This is known as Tiwanaku, and it is the elaboration of this sunken court tradition. You have these stela, beautiful stela that you can see that were in the courts themselves, and they were placed low down in the court, so when you stood above it, it looked as if, in this case, a frog on your right, a snake in the back on the left. So it looks as if the animals were actually coming out of the court. It was, again, a theatrical or performance-like area. In the same way, as you see on the North Coast, we have many, many, many of these courts. We estimate almost 700 sunken courts in the Titicaca Basin in an area of about 8,000 square kilometers in antiquity, and you have a process over time where there's a competitive process where there are fewer and fewer courts and they're larger and larger. Now, the case study I want to briefly touch upon is on the south coast of Peru, and this is the Paracas culture, circa 800 to 100 before Common Era. And you can see down here where it says Chincha right below North Coast. You can see Pachacamac and Chincha, this is the area. If you look at the five valleys, this makes up the Paracas area. This is a Google Earth. You can see looking from the west over the ocean up into the mountains. The mountains shoot up very quickly, leaving these low desert plains that are irrigated, in this case, by two major rivers in Chincha and one river in Pisco. Now, the first monumental architecture that we have in the area is this site called Pozuelo, circa 1000 BCE. And you can see section D and section C. And in the background, this forms a U-shaped structure. It's quite fascinating. We excavated in D, and we get the usual exotic artifacts and wonderful pieces that demonstrate interregional trade, burials, and so forth. If you look at the Google Earth map again, you can see section C, B in the middle and C. The site was actually oriented to the east for the sunrise during the June solstice, indicating some kind of calendar. If you go back up above where it says Chincha, we're going to now look at Paracas at around 400 BC, where we get this incredible ritualized landscape. These are, that's a brother-in-law, and these are two geoglyphs. These lines, these are lines and figures in the desert. These are similar to what we see in the Nazca culture that will come later, and I will briefly mention. But as you look, you can, we discovered these, they hadn't been touched in 2,300 years. You can see a line here. You can see another line here. That's my colleague, Henry Tantalean. We also discovered that people would build the lines, and they would have structures in the middle, sometimes called altars, but the lines themselves were used to frame something on the landscape, in this case, pyramidal structures, but they can be used to frame all sorts of things. But they were using a perspective effect from the ground. And here you can see this extremely long line. On there, it's the same photograph outlined on the right. You can see the two arrows. And this line goes for several kilometers, and it begins at a geoglyph. And so what you have is, you have this notion of a procession that has a beginning point. Throughout all of this line system, and it's about 40 square kilometers, throughout this entire geoglyph system, you have all these structures, and they're quite fascinating. And the one up above is a split eye that actually hits a solstice marker as well. And below, it's also a solstice marker. So, and then we have sites down here, these mound sites that they're at the end of these lines, one of the endpoint. And what we see here are U-shaped structures, again oriented to the solstice. But we also have these blue lines hit the equinox. And so it looks as if they are timing these events. And so between the equinox and the solstice may be a period of time in which people came into the valley to conduct these rituals. Here is just a view looking to the west. That's a 294, which is the solstice again. And here you can see a proof of concept. We have these orange cones where the solstice is coming down, the sun is coming down, setting right on that line. Now, this is really fascinating. This is where people are creating. This is a strange creature known as two UCLA graduate students. But if you look where the sun is merging into the atmosphere on the coast, and if you're standing back, I'm sitting back 50 meters from this platform. In fact, you can imagine in antiquity, people would be dancing or doing whatever they're doing up on top of the mound, and the sun would be literally merging into their heads. It makes for a fascinating spectacle. And so we discovered these alignments and these sites, and we were able to see that these lines also mark solstices. Now they are time markers and then when you put it all together, you get this giant complex of lines and sites. And what we find is they're going to 5 sites and 5 clusters of lines. The entire Pampa was converted into a grand theater. Processions were conducted at least annually. And so we find is ritual pathways, again, 5 of them, and you can see how they go to these different sites. And on the ground, this is what they look like. You can see down below on your right, a solstice marker is one of those 4 up there. It's a solstice marker. There are lines. Each one of those are lines. The lines are going down, and people are following these lines. They're going to these mounded structures, and they are conducting some kinds of rituals. And again, using perspective, it brings all your attention to the endpoint of the procession, which are one of these sites. And here is a reconstruction of that. You can see a series of lines going to different pyramid structures and so forth and so on. Again, people coming from the highlands, coming down, they're meeting people down on the coastal area where the population was living. Very good. Here's another construction. So we get to the end of this and we have a pyramid like this. And we see this site. This is the end point of the procession called Cerro del Gentil. And we excavate in that. And sure enough, what we find are a number of beautiful objects, basketry. No 2 baskets are alike. You see gourds. We have these mummies. Here's a mummy that we've disinterred. It's almost certainly a human sacrifice. Again, the process of unwrapping the mummy. Beautiful textiles, textile reconstruction. Very elaborate and gorgeous objects that you can see that came out of this. And we did, my colleague Kelly Knutson and I did a study of isotope, strontium isotope, and we conclude fairly decisively that the objects come from all over the Andes, highlands, sierras, and coast. So this was not a local phenomenon. They were deriving from a whole series. Now, once you get past this in the Paracas era, you get to the Nazca era, and we see a big change. You have one site, one giant semi-urban or urbanized site, and you have lines everywhere. So this process reaches its apogee with one center dominating the whole process. Basically, the evolutionary game theory, I think, provides us with a way to understand these rituals. And I need not go on here, but again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this.